Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou is a brilliant scholar who is very well written. She is going to point out today that your God, the biblical God, needs to rest. But so did all the other ancient Near Eastern gods. They all needed to sleep at some point. And is the seventh-day Sabbath idea unique only to the God of the Bible? Or was there a well-known sacred idea of a seventh day, or seven, of course, preceding the biblical text in ancient Mesopotamia or in the ancient Near East? Francesca has been under fire as a woman in academia for a very long time, and she shouldn't be respected or listened to because of this idea. Often in academia, she's had this kind of criticism, if you will, or people don't take her serious enough. I think it's important that as you pay attention to today's episode, you recognize the brilliance that she brings to the table. And we thank you, Francesca, for doing this episode with MythVision. Now let's congratulate her, get a copy of her book, and show everyone why we appreciate what she does. This is going to sound a little awkward, but the next question I have is about the Sabbath and seventh day idea. There's a guy who's floated around on the internet. Those in the chat know. He's been very kind to me, don't get me wrong, but he's gone around bragging victory over all these academics that I've had on and saying we're all under a seventh day calendar. And this all started with the God of the Bible, a seventh-day calendar. Therefore, we're all technically responsible, and we are under this God's jurisdiction. So we are all technically sinners who need to repent to this God, because this is the true God. Look, we have 7 days. And I was reading the book. Right, I know. And I was reading the book. The origin of the seventh-day Sabbath was my question. Maybe you have a thought on, but you mentioned a Sumerian lament where Inanna is singing to Enlil because he is sleeping while his people and their land are in famine on page 256. Maybe I can read it, teasing people to really get this book. I can't tell you how much I'm impressed with this. The goddess Inanna traveled from her temple to Uruk to Nippur in the hope of rousing Enlil. Feigning my father's fanes lying down, she cried. May I soothe his heart. May I pacify his liver. May I direct my words to his distressed heart. Sitting on his lap, she sings him awake with the refrain, O sleeping one, how long will you sleep? Inanna's lament was considered so powerful that her cult singers recited it in her temple at Uruk on the 7th day of each month in the hope of appeasing the gods for any unknown misdemeanor which might prompt untimely or stimulated slumber. Precautionary measures were only sensible. Discerning the difference between a sleeping god and a sulking god was not always easy. Many centuries later, in the 6th century CE, Yahweh's worshippers were singing petitions to awaken him to the devastating aftermath of the Babylonian attack. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Yahweh? Awake. Do not cast us off forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's lots of stuff to unpack there. I mean, the seventh day is a very significant number in a lot of ancient Southwest Asian cultures. And so time is very commonly divided up. I mean, not always. I mean, in some contexts, then like in certain Egyptian contexts, the number 10 is very important. But 7 is very common in a lot of ancient Southwest Asian cultures as a means of marking time, and probably primarily, scholars think, because that you could see 7 planets in the night sky, with the naked eye at that time. So these seem to, it was a particularly powerful, special number. So it's not unusual to have 7 pop up a lot across these cultures, and not unusual to have the idea of a period of time being 7 days was not unique to Yahweh worshipping cultures either. So that's one thing. I mean, the idea of the bit that you read is when I'm talking about the notion that for a lot of Yahweh's worshippers, inaction, divine inaction or divine neglect, could be understood to reflect either a God who was sleeping or a God who had simply withdrawn. You know how we all kind of, if you're kind of depressed or tired or sulky, you take to your bed and you just don't want to engage with anybody. Right. It's kind of a similar kind of thing for the gods of the ancient world. They might just withdraw socially completely. And so when in that particular poem that I referred to in the Hebrew Bible, arouse, wake up, O arm of Yahweh, that's because that was written in the time of the Babylonian destruction and exile. So destruction of the temple, the exile of elites to Babylonia. And they're saying, they're singing to Yahweh's arm, his fighting arm, wake up, you have to kind of rescue us from enslavement in a foreign land. You have to come and fight for us. They just assumed that his withdrawal is because he's sleeping, so he has completely disappeared from their lives. So that was very common.
The idea of Sabbath meaning 7, but also is rest, is that this is predating the Bible by millennia. I mean, the Yahweh cult is late, Johnny come lately again, right, on this notion, but the unique way that they've kind of instrumented it to be, that might be unique, right? How they've made it into be, or is there a Sabbath that preceding this culture where they're resting with their God?
Some scholars will certainly argue that in certain cults of particular deities that you had a Shabbat, a day of rest. And that was as much for the deity as it was for worshippers. But yeah, like I said, there's very little that is kind of purely innovative in some ways. Like when you're looking at these kinds of the ways in which the ritual calendar is organized, and the ways in which certain sacrifices function, the ways in which certain, ideas about what a temple is, what a deity is, there's I'm not saying there's nothing innovative, but the grand shape of things is not particularly exceptional in that sense. But I like the idea of, we've got this sense that, the Sabbath, Shabbat is a day of reflection and kind of theological thinking, and not working because you're meant to be focused very much on the idea of being in this relationship with the deity. But you get a particular verse in Exodus in which, Yahweh himself is talking, and he sort of says that, on the 7th day, he had to catch his breath, because he was tired, having made the universe in days 1 to 6. He was tired, or, he was running out of puff on the 7th day.
You see that
so
in the Hebrew,
is that
right?
sense of rest. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we're not
in
reading
Hebrew,
that.
Yeah, in the Hebrew, in that particular verse in Exodus, it uses the same word that's used to describe the kind of catching, someone who's been doing hard manual labor, kind of like sitting and resting and catching their breath like that. It's the same word that's used, which is a really nice image. It's a very companionable image, isn't it? Kind of likening it, kind of theologically, it's showing that God put all this exertion and work into creating this beautiful world. So in some ways, it's kind of nice.
Yeah. In some ways. And then in other ways, I kind of want to emphasize the ancient construction worker God was. In fact, he must be the first person who was ever making humans from clay, I suspect, right? I'm being sarcastic here to read a part of your book, page 277. Again, I love this, by the way. I cannot tell you. I'm like, I pause the Audible, and then I go in and I write it down, and then I get the page and I'm highlighting. It's my Bible. Clay shaping bodies had long been a ritual actively undertaken by both gods and mortals. In a Sumerian myth, the ingenious god Enki and the birth goddess Nenma had crafted the first humans from clay. What's this? Peopling their temples, I think. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Peopling their temples, farms, and fields with worshippers devoted to their service. In a related tradition, the goddess Mami chanted an incantation as Enki trod the clay for her to shape into people. At Ugarit, it was process similarly performed by El, who had made an exorcism goddess from clay to cure King Kurta. I shall create a remover of sickness, an expeller of disease. He fills his hands with the best of clay. He pinches off that which is used by a potter. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the god most frequently associated with the creation of humans was Khnum, who crafted all living things, including some gods, on his potter's will. I love that. You are the master of the will. Who is pleased to model on the will? You have made humans on the will. You have created the gods. You have modeled the small and large cattle. You have formed everything on your will each day in your name, Khnum, the potter. That sounds like the Bible, but way earlier.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like, clay shaping is, the one that it was the most important substance in some ways within these particular cultures, because it's so, it's there, it's everywhere. You need good quality clay to make kind of like a figurine or whatever. But but it's the base stuff of life, the understanding that humans are made from, not just humans, but other living beings are made from clay, as you've demonstrated, wasn't just a biblical kind of idea. It was a much older, far more widespread idea across ancient Southwest Asia. So yeah, the idea that humans made, when humans made their figurines of gods out of clay, they were mimicking the gods themselves who made humans out of clay. So it's the primal matter of life in these particular cultures. But yeah, it's a lovely image, and yeah, like I think that's why it's so important to set these biblical texts within their broader cultural context, is because otherwise you get all sorts of claims being made about the innovative, unique status of certain theological ideas, and therefore they are so exclusive that therefore they must be true. They're not. But it's, they're all drawing on a much wider, broader, richer cultural tradition, and it's just that Yahweh just happens to be one God among many, who but he just happens to be the God that's kind of survived into the modern day, unlike Inanna or which is such a shame. I'd much rather we had her still around.
I wish we knew a lot more too about these gods that come before, because we kind of only know from our tradition what's being preserved, and I just wish we knew a lot more.